Is part of it that back then, in the early 70s, people would put their trust in the government? They would say, well, the state says we need this. We need the state agency to oversee zoning. It's in our best interest to preserve the wilds of the Adirondacks. Is that something that just wouldn't happen today? Would people not put their trust in the government like they did in the early 70s?
Yes, I think that's a factor. And also in this particular case, there were 19 million people in New York in 1970, and only 100,000 of them lived inside the blue line. So really, it was easy for a legislator or a person living in the suburbs of Rochester, as Liz Thorndike was at the time, to say, yes, we should do this. It's a good idea. We need to protect this natural resource, because it was almost an abstraction. And so really one of the interesting things about this project is it's a story about the rights of minority groups, even though in this case the minority group was white rural landowners.
And while it's celebrated on one hand, on the other, did the APA early on make mistakes? Were they tone deaf to a number of things that made it more difficult?
Oh yes, I think the APA really was an amazing accomplishment in many ways, but it had a major flaw, which was not entirely its own fault, in that it didn't really listen to local people before it put the laws into effect. So that the laws, when they were presented to people inside the blue line, they just felt like an insult. They felt insulted that they hadn't been talked to, they hadn't been listened to, and that the new order had come from Albany, and it felt like an invasion. So the opposition to the APA was really came from a place of insult, not necessarily economic loss.
And you wanted to make sure that you talked to a lot of those opponents, right? You really wanted to balance this story, to have both sides. Being a longtime journalist, you wanted to hear from a lot of those opponents about what motivated them.
Yes, I wanted to talk to the opposition and save what I could of their movement, because the environmental movement's records were exquisitely well preserved. And I didn't have any trouble finding environmentalists who were willing to talk at length about this major accomplishment that they were very proud of. But the opposition was almost entirely undocumented. And as I got further into the story, I realized that that was a very interesting aspect of this, and that the people on the other side really had some good points. So as I worked further into the oral history project, I tried harder and harder to find people who had fought the APA, and I'm very glad I did.
You ended up interviewing 50, 60 people altogether?
It's about 60 now.
60 people,
yeah.
all key insiders, pioneers, many of them, and great stories about the environmentalists, George Davis, Clarence Petty, who was certainly well known by many people, a state forest ranger, and so you really brought to light many of the people behind the scenes who were so passionate about making this happen, making it a reality, and on the flip side, people who were so dead set against it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found that really kept me engaged for all the time it took me to do this is that people in the North Country tend to be excellent storytellers. I think it's the long, dark winters. People really know how to spin yarns up here. And so, I would just show up at somebody's house and turn on my tape recorder, and all of this great stuff would be coming out of the subject. And so it was a joy to really collect that material.
And I've got to ask you already talked about some of the stories with George Davis being hired by the developer, but anything come to mind as far as just some really great stories from some of these characters?
Oh, there are so many of them. One of my favorites is, again, from George Davis. He was the first employee of the Adirondack Park Agency. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, Nelson Rockefeller basically didn't fund the agency very well, didn't support it in Albany.
The state was going through a budget crisis at the time.
Correct. There was no money. So he was alone for a long time. George said that he got the key to the abandoned building in Raybrook that the agency had been allowed to use, the log cabin there. Got the key from the DEC guy next door, And he went in on his first day, and there was absolutely nothing inside, and nobody inside, nothing. It was an empty building. He was the Adirondack Park Agency. So what he decided to do was he got a purchase order, which he had learned from the DEC guy that you could take into town and use to get stuff. And he bought 2 cartons of toilet paper, 2 big cartons of toilet paper. He brought them back, and he used one of them for his desk and one of them for his chair. And when the phone got hooked up, he put the phone on top of one of the cartons of toilet paper. He said it was like that for several weeks. He eventually got furniture by begging for it, because there was no money to buy furniture. But he found that the prison in Raybrook was getting rid of some desks. The prison in Raybrook was getting rid of some desks, and some great camps were breaking up. And so he furnished the Adirondack Park Agency offices, basically on the 1971 version of Craigslist.
Humble beginnings. You talked about, at the end of the book, how you had a lot of research, a wealth of research, and so you still have more. You're sitting down with many of these people, talking for hours on end, which the audio recordings, the videotape are certainly priceless, but you have a wealth of research that you still haven't necessarily gotten to. So is there another book coming out of this potentially?
Yes, I am actively working on a second volume right now that will talk about the 1970s and beyond. When the pandemic closed everything down, I had done all of the research and interviewing that I needed to do to get the reader to the point where the law was signed. So that's where this current book ends, is with the formation of the opposition and the signing of the law. But I have all of this other stuff that's still on the table. So now I'm going around interviewing, doing additional interviews, additional research, and I hope to produce a second volume in a couple of years.
And you'll look at some of the big land sales that happened in the 80s, 90s, and Finch Prine in 2007?
Yes, I was very fortunate to be able to interview George Pataki. And Pataki, you know, not surprisingly, was very eager to talk about the 1 million acres of forest preserve that he protected under his administration. And so those big land deals, really starting with Bay Pond in the late 1970s and ending with the massive Finch Prine deal in 2007, will be part of this next volume. Big land deals always have interesting stories attached to them.